Initial selection devices are used to screen applicants. They are the first tests that applicants take. The data can be used to screen out those applicants who don't meet the very basic qualifications of the job. It is used in the first stage of the process, and we will cover two examples: application forms, which many of you are familiar with, and background checks. One of the most popular screening tests is the application form. It can be used to collect information about work experience, education, volunteer experience, training, credentials, skills, coursework, and other relevant characteristics. Most applications can be found online and submitted online. These forms are often evaluated using software that looks for keywords related to the job. For example, when you submit an application through Indeed or Monster, their algorithm, their software, scans your resume and looks for words in your resume that match the job description. If a job description includes the word leader, leadership, leads, led many, many times, and your resume doesn't include any of those words, your resume goes to the bottom of the stack and may never be seen by the hiring manager. Unfortunately, the review process is usually unstructured, unstandardized. A hiring manager flips through a stack of resumes or clicks through a stack of resumes, but doesn't have a structured way of assessing these applications. The problem with that is we can't defend that decision in a court of law. Best practice says we need a structured, systematic, standardized, objective way of reviewing applications. Application blanks that include these weights are called weighted application blanks. They include weighting systems for the different items on the application. We do this by following a series of steps and by relying on statistics to identify which items should stay and which items should go. The first thing we have to do is identify the criteria that we are trying to predict. In most situations, we're trying to predict high performance, but we might also look at things like counterproductive work behaviors, organizational citizenship behaviors, tenure, absenteeism, tardiness. After we've identified the criteria, we then try to figure out which items predict those outcomes by giving the application blank to current employees. Then we give the application blank to current employees to have them fill it out. We compare their performance data with their answers on the application blank. We use statistics to identify correlations. What we're looking for are large, strong correlations. We're trying to find the items on the application blank that are correlated with high performance. Once we have identified these correlations, then we can assign different weights to the different items. Items that have strong correlations, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, these items are weighted more, they count more towards the total score than the items with weaker correlations, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. The final step then is to determine that cut score, the score below which employees may be a risk, a bad risk for an employer. The key with weighted application blanks is that they rely on statistics to determine the items, the weights, as well as the cutoff scores. On this slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the considerations we need to make about application forms. First and foremost, they should be used only to screen applicants. Do not ask about race, gender, nationality, marital status, dependents, or family obligations. These qualities about applicants have nothing to do with the job and can result in a discrimination lawsuit if you ask them. In the last lecture, we learned about e-recruiting, recruiting online. Today's organizations are also using photos and video resumes in the application process. But beware, using identifying information like a photo or a video can also lead to discrimination lawsuits. We are not supposed to use protected class characteristics to hire individuals. Well, having a photo or a video right in front of you tells you a lot about that person, more than their resume, piece of paper may share with them. We have to be careful with using photos and video resumes in the application process. For most jobs, however, someone's appearance is not relevant to the job, and I would recommend that you not collect photo and video information from applicants. Background checks are used to verify the information provided on an application form or information provided later on in the application process. We can evaluate personal references such as letters of recommendation. We can verify social media profiles, posts, comments, credit histories, and criminal records are also sometimes assessed using these checks. Good faith efforts to verify previous employment can provide an excellent defense against negligent hiring. There are some situations where an employer can actually get in trouble for not doing their due diligence when they hire an individual, and that individual does something catastrophic, hurts someone, kills someone. In those situations, an employer who does a background check has extra protection, extra evidence that they did in fact do their due diligence in the process and tried to find out as much as they could about this person before they hired them. The ratings can be inaccurate and biased. Previous employers rarely provide useful information about employees. They tend to provide only positive information because they are afraid that they will be taken to court for defamation. Rarely does this happen. Rarely does an employer need to worry about sharing poor performance data with a hiring organization. Letter writers also succumb to the same bias. Letter writers generally share extremely positive information about the applicant. Rarely will they discuss weaknesses. Raters may discriminate against some applicants based on their profile pictures or based on the information shared on their profile page. Some studies, for instance, suggest that raters of social media pages, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, that these raters prefer female applicants, white applicants, and applicants who are extremely attractive. If you decide to use background checks in the selection process, there are a few things you have to keep in mind because the reports are regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act and several state laws. You must give notice to applicants that you are going to conduct a background check. You cannot conduct one of these checks without first letting the applicant know that you are going to do so. You must provide the candidates with a summary of their rights under federal law. You must also certify with the investigating company that you will use the reports appropriately. And finally, you must provide a copy of the report in a letter to the job applicant. Now that we've talked about screening tests, let's talk about the substantive selection tests devices that we use in the heart of the selection process. These tests are used to evaluate the match, the fit between applicants' knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, what we call KSAOs, between their KSAOs and the requirements of the job. If you remember, in the initial stage, we are just screening for basic qualifications. Once we get to this stage of the process, we are looking for the highly qualified, the most talented applicants. We will cover a few examples in this lecture, including written tests, performance simulation tests, and interviews. Written employment tests include cognitive ability tests, knowledge tests, personality tests, and even integrity tests. All of these tests are attempting to measure applicants' internal qualities, the qualities that we can't necessarily measure behaviorally. They tend to be useful predictors of performance in a variety of jobs across a variety of industries. This is good news because many people don't like employment tests, especially personality tests, but they are surprisingly predictive. Commercially available employment tests rely on norms to give meaning to the scores. Your results will be compared to the results of many other people to help understand where you lie in terms of your performance both on the test, but also potential performance on the job. These tests can be found in what we call the Mental Measurements Yearbook. It is a book that is published every year, and I'm not kidding you when I tell you it is several inches thick. You can also find many of the tests online. You can find information about reliability, validity, their publisher, when they were developed, the types of items, the norms, how they are scored, and for many organizations, most importantly, the cost of some of these tests. Cognitive ability tests are a type of intelligence test. They are designed to measure applicants' ability to reason, apply logic, and solve everyday problems. There are two basic types. Aptitude tests are focused on your ability to learn new things. Achievement tests are focused on what you've already learned, on what you have done, what you have achieved in the past. I have a couple of examples of aptitude tests. The Wonderlic and the Wechsler are popular intelligence tests that qualify as aptitude tests. The graduate record examination, the GRE, is a test that many psychology majors will need to take in order to get into graduate school. The GRE is also designed to assess your ability, your capacity for learning new information. An example of an achievement test would be your college exams. The quizzes you take in this class, the exams you take in your other classes are designed to assess how well you have learned the information you were supposed to learn, how well you understand that information. Here are a few sample items from the Wonderlic Personnel Test, which has been renamed to the Wonderlic Contemporary Cognitive Ability Test. Unfortunately, there have been several cases in the history of the United States that have pointed to the potential for disparate impact. The Griggs versus Duke Power Company case and the Albemarle Paper Company versus Moody case. In both of these cases, the cognitive ability test that was used favored one group over another group. Some people argue that this is because the majority of cognitive ability tests are created by white individuals. This certainly can play a role, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we still have questions regarding how cognitive ability tests can and should be used in selection processes. They should only be used if you can prove, one, that they do not impact negatively one group over another, and two, they are job relevant. They are predictive of performance in a particular role. If you can meet those two qualifications, then you probably can use the cognitive ability test. You just have to be really careful. In order to avoid disparate impact, you need to do a number of other things. Set a minimum cutoff score so that there is no violation of the 80% rule. This increases the number of people who pass the test and could result in hiring less qualified applicants. However, it protects you from breaking an employment law and violating an applicant's rights. Use statistical banding to group applicants in bands of equal qualifications. So you might have your top 25%, your middle 50%, and then your bottom 25%. You want to make sure that your recruitment strategies are fair and are targeting all individuals, including those that are in the minority group. This increases the likelihood that applicants have the necessary qualifications, that your applicant pool is sufficiently large for you to choose highly qualified individuals, and it also lessens the risk of disparate impact. The final suggestion, and probably the most important suggestion, is that you combine the use of a cognitive ability test with other types of selection tests. Here's a summary of the advantages and disadvantages of cognitive ability tests. They are valid predictors across many jobs in many different industries. They are especially useful when the job requires complex cognitive thinking, or when the job requires extensive learning on the job. These tests are easy to administer. They've already been created. You buy them from another company. Sometimes that company even scores them for you. They can be a cost-effective strategy if you have the data, you have the numbers, and you can provide evidence that they actually save money as opposed to costing money. They are difficult to fake. That is one of the strengths of a cognitive ability test. Sure, people can guess the right answer, but more so than on a personality test, these tests are difficult to fake. The disadvantages are that they can cause disparate impact. They can be difficult to justify in a court of law, even if they are job relevant. This is especially true when there is evidence of disparate impact. If your intelligence test is biased, no amount of job relevant data is going to allow you to keep that test. You must get rid of it and replace it with a test that does not have a negative impact on one group more than the other. Finally, the development can be costly, time-consuming, and complex if you choose to do it in-house. I wouldn't recommend it, but for some bigger organizations like government agencies, police departments, military, large organizations where the test is going to be used again and again and again and again, it makes sense to invest in that initial development phase so that you can tailor it to the job, you can collect norm data, you can validate the test, and save money in the long run. Another type of written employment test is the knowledge-based test. This measures a sample of the information needed to do a job. Two types of knowledge that we might look at. We can look at declarative knowledge, knowledge of what? Knowledge of the facts associated with some concept. For instance, in our class in personnel psychology, the quizzes are designed to assess your declarative knowledge, your knowledge of facts in the class. Procedural knowledge is knowledge of how to do something. What, but also how to do it. The reflection exercises in this class are designed to be more of a procedural knowledge test. I want you to actually do something, create a recruitment plan, create a selection plan. I want you to try to figure out how to do it as opposed to just knowing what it is and knowing the steps. Examples of a knowledge test include the driver's test that you have to take before you get in the car with the person at the DMV. I have an example here on the screen of one of the questions that you might find on your driving test. These tests are valid predictors in a variety of jobs and industries, just like the cognitive ability tests. They have high face validity. What this means is that when applicants see a knowledge test, they agree this is job relevant. This appears at face value to be a test that is related to the job. They can see immediately the connection between getting the driver's license and taking a test about the rules of the road. They are also difficult to fake. They can be easy and cost-effective to administer. They can also be useful for training needs. The disadvantages of knowledge tests include that they must be updated frequently as things in the job change, as things in the industry change. Those tests then have to be updated. In some situations, the knowledge test is just not relevant because the knowledge can be easily learned on the job. Finally, development is costly and time-consuming, which is why so many companies turn to commercially available tests that you can find in the Mental Measurements Yearbook. Another type of written employment test is the personality test, which is designed to measure stable patterns of behavior. They are known to predict a variety of different outcomes: honesty, integrity, stealing, theft, theft of goods, theft of time, accident proneness, safety orientation, applicants' orientation toward the customer, and turnover, tenure, absenteeism, tardiness. Of all the personality tests that we might use, those that are based on the Big Five model tend to be the most reliable and predictive of performance. There are 5 dimensions, and you can see them here. Openness to experience is the first dimension. This is the tendency to be open to new ideas, new experiences, trying new things. This dimension predicts creativity and employees' readiness, willingness to be trained. Conscientiousness is the tendency to get things done and perform well, to do your job or a task or your hobby really well. 25% of a manager's performance can be explained by this variable, by this individual difference. Managers who score high on conscientiousness also tend to be high performers. Those who score lower on conscientiousness tend to be lower performers. Extroversion is the tendency to be energized by other people, energized in social situations. Introverts tend to be energized when they're alone, when they spend time by themselves. Many of us think of extroversion, introversion in terms of whether or not individuals like to be around other people, but that's not really an accurate description of the dimension. Carl Jung created this dimension, introversion, extroversion, and his personality theory was all about psychic energy. Today, most of the Big Five models and descriptions will include this word energy or recharge in the definition, because introverts don't necessarily not like people and extroverts don't necessarily like people. That's not quite what makes someone extroverted versus introverted. It has to do with how you recharge, how you get your energy. Extroversion is predictive of a variety of outcomes in a variety of jobs. It's not quite as consistent as conscientiousness, but extroversion does have value for predicting performance in many jobs. Part of being a manager, part of being a leader involves working with other people, being around other people. Agreeableness is the tendency to get along with others, to compromise, to accommodate their needs. It is predictive of team success. Emotional stability is the fifth dimension. It was originally called the neuroticism dimension. This is the tendency for individuals to remain emotionally balanced, even in stressful situations. Like conscientiousness, emotional stability also tends to be predictive across all jobs because all jobs require some degree of emotional stability. Even if you never interact with another human being in your job, your work still requires that you can remain emotionally calm, emotionally stable. There are two broad categories of personality tests. Screen-in tests are designed to measure normal personality. Screen-out tests are designed to measure abnormal personality. I have a couple of examples of each type, each broad category. You will see that the NEO personality inventory appears on both lists. You can use screen-in personality tests during this stage of the selection process, pre-offer stage. You cannot use screen-out personality tests unless you have already given a job offer to an applicant. But the NEO shows up on both lists. So how do I know whether I can use the NEO? It depends on your intent. If you are trying to keep people in the process, if you're trying to identify high performers, you can use the NEO during this stage. If you are trying to identify people who need to be kicked out, people who have abnormal personality, they have issues with emotional stability, you need to wait to use the NEO until you have decided which individuals you think you want to hire. You make a job offer and then can use the NEO to weed out individuals with abnormal personalities. To select the best personality tests, I have a few recommendations here. You want to avoid projective tests like the ink blot test. Those tests are not reliable, they're not valid, and they will not hold up in a court of law. You want to make sure that you understand the ins and outs of the test, why it was designed, the individuals it was intended to be used with. Study the test manual carefully before you purchase it. Make sure you check the reviews of the test in the Mental Measurements Yearbook. You can purchase the book or you can look at summaries of the tests online on the Mental Measurements Yearbook website. Go to Google Scholar and see if you can find evidence that this test has produced adverse impact. See if you can find evidence for validation studies done at other organizations. Obtain a copy of the test beforehand, check all of the items, and then I strongly recommend that you stick to tests based on the Big Five. The good thing about personality tests, especially those based on the Big Five model, the good thing is they are predictive of a variety of outcomes: performance, counterproductive work behaviors, organizational citizenship behaviors. They are easy and cost effective to administer. And again, sometimes the company that developed them will score them for you. The problem is, and this is a big problem, they are easy to fake. We all know that. We all know that it is fairly easy for individuals to mark their answers as they see fit. They also tend to have low face validity, meaning employees don't always see the connection between a personality test and the job. Another disadvantage is that there are many personality tests available that are not predictive, and it's easy to lose sight of the strengths of the Big Five model when we have tests like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Some of you maybe have taken the MBTI, but unfortunately it cannot be used to select employees. It is not a valid predictor of job performance, whereas the Big Five model is. Integrity tests are one of the more recent developments in the field of personnel psychology. They are designed to measure a number of things: beliefs, judgments, perceptions, support, and self-perceptions. Beliefs about unethical behavior, judgments about punishment for unethical behavior, the perceptions about how easy it is to misbehave, individuals' support for excuses, justifications, reasons why they should be allowed to sometimes misbehave, and also their own assessments of how honest they are in real life. We have two categories of integrity tests from which to choose. Overt tests come right out and ask the test taker about their attitudes, perceptions, assessments related to dishonest behavior. So I have a couple of examples here of some questions that we might ask. How often do you tell the truth? How many people cheat on their income taxes? Personality-based integrity tests are more covert. Do you like taking risks? How often do you make your bed? These items are designed to measure personality traits that are then used to infer whether or not someone has an honest attitude and will behave in an ethical manner. Integrity tests are known to be valid predictors of many outcomes, not necessarily of many jobs, but of many outcomes. They are also less likely to produce adverse impact, less likely than personality tests and cognitive ability tests. They are easy and cost-effective to administer because they've already been created. The disadvantages are that applicants rarely see their scores. Applicants don't always understand how these tests work, how they're scored, what their scores mean, because they don't get their scores. Well, this leads then to that third point, which is that integrity tests often have low face validity. Applicants do not see the connection between these tests and the job. And that's because they are easy to fake. If you are trying to predict whether or not someone is going to steal, cheat, show up late, leave early, you're actually better off using a personality test than you are an integrity test in many cases. So performance simulation tests are the second category of substantive selection devices. These tests are designed to measure behavioral responses that are similar to those required on the job. Examples include physical ability tests, work samples, assessment centers, and situational judgment tests. The one thing that all of these tests have in common is that they attempt to simulate the job. On the screen, you see an image of a cockpit simulator. These simulators are used to not only train pilots, but also to hire them. This is one of the most predictive types of tests that we can use. These tests are the most predictive of the tests. They are most closely associated with performance. And that makes sense, right? Because these tests are trying to replicate the actual job and the work environment. So let's talk a little bit about these different types of tests. Physical ability tests measure applicants' ability to meet the physical demands of the job. These tests usually measure a variety of physical abilities at the same time. On the slide, I have an example of one of the tests that firefighter cadets might have to complete. They have to put on all of the equipment, and they have to be able to carry it up several flights of stairs several times. They have to be able to do that in order to pass this test. This type of test makes sense for any job that requires physical movement. A job analysis is going to tell you which abilities are required and how often those abilities come into play. So we go back to that job analysis and we look at the frequency, the importance of different physical abilities, and we base our test off of the information we collect from that job analysis. Just like any other test, we have to make sure that our physical ability tests are not discriminating against one group over the other. Let me show you two different examples of common cases that come up in regards to physical ability tests. Older applicants may be disadvantaged because as we age, we naturally lose muscle, stamina, and flexibility. So if a job requires a great deal of muscle, stamina, and flexibility, we have to think about how our test may give younger applicants an advantage over older applicants. Female applicants may be disadvantaged because they naturally have less muscle mass and less stamina than male applicants. For physically demanding jobs, physical ability tests are often a must. They are predictive of performance in these jobs. They also help identify people who cannot fulfill essential job duties. There are some jobs that I, in my current state at my current age, would just not be able to do. Jobs that require a lot of heavy lifting. At this point, I'm not ready for that, and I would not be able to meet those basic qualifications of the job. And so therefore a physical ability test would help the employer determine that Amy should not be considered for this role because this role requires somebody to lift boxes all day long. These tests are difficult to fake, but they can result in adverse impact, and they can be time-consuming and costly to both develop and to administer. Physical ability tests are an example of a selection test that is usually made in-house. It is customized for a specific role in a specific organization, and it's based on job analysis information. Work sample tests are the preferred method of assessing applicants. This is the gold standard. Across most meta-analyses, work sample tests show up at the top, at least in the top 3, in terms of being the most predictive of job performance. These tests are designed to measure applicants' ability to do some aspects of the job in an environment that is similar to the job. The work sample test relies heavily on job analysis data in order to identify the relevant aspects of the job. This is where it helps to have not only the manager and the job incumbent, but also information from ONET and subject matter experts. If you have job analysis information from all 4 of those sources, you can create a really awesome, predictive, valid, reliable work sample test on your own. I have 2 examples, 2 categories of work samples that we might use. Motor work samples, where we're having people, do something with their hands, a physical task. There's also verbal work samples, where we have people, knowledge workers, perform aspects of the job that don't necessarily have a physical component, but they have more of a communication, interpersonal aspect to them. So I've got 2 lists here of examples. Let's take a look at some of the considerations we need to make if we choose to use a work sample test. Work sample tests are the most valid predictors of performance. They have high face validity. They are difficult to fake. If you don't know how to do the job, you don't know how to do the job. They are less likely to cause adverse impact, and this is because they are focused on behaviors. They are based on a job analysis, and because they are highly relevant to the job. For all of these reasons, work sample tests are probably the most easily defensible test in a court of law. The problem with work sample tests is they don't assess potential. They don't assess applicants' ability to learn on the job. And the development and administration of a work sample test costly and time consuming. An assessment center is a collection of performance simulation tests, all of which are designed to measure behaviors in an environment that mimics the real job environment. There are several different types of tests and exercises that we might include in an assessment center. In a customer situation exercise, we ask applicants to help a customer with a common problem that they might face on the job. In an employee discussion exercise, we ask applicants to have a conversation with an employee about some topic that regularly comes up on the job, whether it be giving feedback or addressing an undesirable behavior. All of these types of assessments are focused on the interpersonal interaction and communication between two individuals. The traditional in-basket exercise is we bring an applicant into an office space. We give them a stack of memos, letters, to-do lists, callbacks, and give them a certain amount of time to go through that stack of information. This stack is meant to mimic real world, real job tasks. Problem analysis exercises ask applicants to solve a problem that often arises on the job and observe how they go about solving the problem and how they work with other people to get that problem solved. The main point of this slide is really that first bullet point. We use these combinations of tests to try to evaluate a variety of behaviors that are relevant to the job. If we have a list of 10 behaviors that are incredibly important to someone's job, then an assessment center may be the way to go. We might look at leadership, interpersonal skills, an individual's ability to organize and plan for the future, problem-solving skills, decision-making tendencies, communication, adaptability, decisiveness. All of these behaviors can be measured with assessment centers. Assessment centers are most often used to hire managers and leaders, especially top-level leaders. We don't use assessment centers to hire large numbers of individuals. This picture that I have on the screen is an example of an assessment center. So here we see 6 applicants sitting around a table. They are probably completing some type of problem-solving task. The 2 individuals sitting in the background, sort of observing, those are the raters. Those are the individuals who know what the job requires and are assessing how the 6 applicants are working together, what they're saying, what they're doing. Are they smiling? Are they nice? Do they say mean things? Do they yell? Do they get upset? Those raters are watching how the applicants behave in a real life situation. Assessment centers are valid predictors of many outcomes. They have high face validity. They are focused on behaviors, things we can observe as opposed to things we can't see, like personality and honesty. They are useful for identifying training needs and for hiring top-level leaders. But because they require extensive training for the raters, and because they are extremely costly and time-consuming to administer, we usually reserve assessment centers for smaller groups of applicants, particularly those in leadership positions. The final type of performance simulation test that I'd like to mention is the situational judgment test, which asks applicants to judge how they might respond in a situation. I have an example of a situation. What would you do? These tests can be valid predictors of many outcomes. They have high face validity because the situations that are presented come from the job analysis. They are created based on what employees, managers, subject matter experts say are typical situations faced by job incumbents. Situational judgment tests also provide what we call incremental validity. You can add a situational judgment test to most existing selection systems and gain additional insight. Sometimes when you add a selection test, it doesn't provide you with any extra information. Situational judgment tests are known for being able to predict parts of job performance that are not typically predicted by the other measures. And these tests, interestingly, are actually as predictive as the super expensive and time-consuming assessment centers. They are easy to fake. That's a huge problem. That is one of the reasons why we sometimes go with the expensive assessment center. It's because situational judgment tests are easy to fake. It's easy to see on the previous slide which answer you should choose. These tests can be time-consuming and costly to develop and administer because they're made in-house, they are customized and based on job analysis information. The interview is the most common substantive selection test used in the United States today, the interview. Many interviews, it's hard to tell how many, but many interviews are unstructured. Best practice tells us that in order for interviews to be predictive of performance and to meet ethical and legal standards, they need to be structured. They need to ask the same questions in the same order and use the same rating system to evaluate responses to these questions. Most interviews focus on KSAOs, things like your knowledge of the job, your previous work experience, your interests, and even your perception of fit with the job and with the organization. They should rely on job analysis. The questions should be based on things that are relevant to the job. What is your favorite color? What is your age? What is your gender? Those questions are not relevant to the job and should not be asked verbally or on an application blank. The questions should always be evaluated and evaluated on a continuous basis for bias and adverse impact. These structured interviews tend to be substantially more predictive than unstructured interviews. Many structured interviews are conducted between two individuals, but we can also conduct what is called a panel interview, where applicants are asked questions by several different interviewers. By averaging their ratings of applicants, we can get a more accurate and less biased assessment of each person's KSAOs. Structured behavioral interviews are a variation of the structured interview. These often occur between two individuals. The interviewer asks applicants to describe how they've handled situations in the past. Situational judgment tests are focused on what would you do. Structured behavioral interviews are focused on what have you done. The interviewers provide a situation. Tell me about a time when you made a mistake. What did you do about it? Applicants, you are expected to answer using what we call the STAR method. We want you to explain the situation, give us some context, help us understand where were you working, who were you working with. You don't need to include any names, but just give some context. The T in STAR stands for task. Tell us the problem. Tell us the mistake. Tell us about the goal or the task you were tasked with. The A stands for action. Tell us what you did and focus on the specific behaviors. Describe exactly what you did to solve that problem or make up for your mistake. And then the R in the star stands for results. Explain how your action had a positive impact on the organization. Many employers today do not follow best practices when it comes to creating structured interviews. You want to make sure that you are focusing on behaviors, that you are using job analysis information to create your questions. You want to make sure that you train your interviewers. Using more than one interviewer is a great strategy, but then need to train those interviewers as well. So what's the problem with unstructured interviews? Why are they so bad? Without structure, interviewers and raters tend to rely on information that is not relevant to the job to make their decision. They pay attention to negative information more than positive information, and they tend to favor the applicants who are very similar to them, who dress the same way, who have the same interests, who maybe even speak the same way. Some of you maybe have went to an interview and realized that the person interviewing you has a similar accent or uses words in a similar way, and it immediately creates a bond, right? Oh, we're both from the Midwest. Oh, we're both from Chicago. Oh, we're both from SIUE. Immediately you make a connection. Without structure, humans, even HR managers, will rely on that connection, which is somewhat superficial, right? The two just met, they're not really friends, it's not related to the job. That superficial connection can get in the way of making an accurate judgment about who should be hired, who will perform the job well. Even with structure, interviews are still susceptible to discrimination. Discriminatory intent occurs when raters ask non-job related questions of only one protected class of individuals. An interviewer who asks only women, do you plan to have children in the future, but doesn't ask that question of men, that is discriminatory intent. Discriminatory impact is less overt, it is more covert. This occurs when interviewers ask questions that implicitly screen out a majority of applicants in a protected class. I once had a client who asked all of the applicants whether they had children that they needed to get on the school bus in the morning. He would use this question to implicitly screen out the majority of women, but also some of the men who were single parents. To improve the validity of interviews, there are a number of things that we can do. Always avoid unstructured interviews. Go the extra mile to make them structured, which means relying on job analysis information, standardizing the questions, standardizing the procedure, standardizing what is said, what is not said, standardizing the rating form, and also making sure that the physical environment is relatively the same across interviews. Make sure that you use multiple raters. Ideally, 3 is better than 1 or 2. And finally, make sure that you train your raters. Make sure that the interviewers understand the importance of structured interviews. They understand the procedure. They understand why they are to ask the questions in the order that they are presented. And most importantly, how to rate responses in the interview. All of these strategies can help us make sure that we're hiring the best employees. Structured interviews are valid predictors of many outcomes. They have high face validity, mostly because so many applicants expect them. They expect an interview to be part of the process. They allow applicants to share information about themselves with the employer, but they also allow the employer to share information about the job, the culture, the company's history with applicants. Two-way exchange of information as opposed to one-way with all of the other tests we've talked about so far. The problem is structured interviews are known to create adverse impact, both unstructured and structured. Interviewers require training. Anytime a selection test requires training, it's an added step, it's an added expense that sometimes we don't have time for, and sometimes we don't have the budget for. Development and administration can be costly and time consuming. Structured interviews are easy to fake. People can lie. People can say whatever they want to. We can use background checks to try to validate the information shared in structured interviews, but it is still difficult to try to figure out whether or not Amy actually did that thing she said she did. The third stage of the selection process involves the use of contingent selection devices. These tests provide a final check of applicants' qualifications. One last test to make sure that these individuals are the individuals we should hire. The reason these tests are saved for the third stage is because there are more legal considerations that we need to make if we decide to use them. Examples include drug tests and medical exams. Drug tests are used to measure trace amounts of prohibited substances in samples provided by applicants. We can take blood, urine, spit, hair, and breath in order to measure the amount of the substance in the sample. These drug tests are most predictive of counterproductive work behaviors. There are some people who argue that drug testing without reasonable suspicion is an invasion of privacy and unfair. Employers argue that drug abuse can be extremely costly for the organization and can decrease productivity. The US Supreme Court tends to side with employers on this issue. They concluded that drug tests are minimally invasive and rarely violate individuals' rights. State laws and collective bargaining agreements also apply to the use of drug tests. Like physical ability tests, drug tests help us identify individuals who cannot perform the most basic essential functions of the job. They are the most difficult of all the tests to fake. It is possible to fake drug tests depending on the test that we're using. Some tests are more reliable than others. For instance, the hair test is extremely reliable, whereas the mouth swab is not quite as reliable as the hair test. They have high face validity, especially for jobs in public safety, transportation. So think about police officers, pilots, bus drivers, individuals who are responsible for other people's lives. 100% of my clients who have decided to start drug testing outsource this test. When my clients hire a new employee, they make a phone call and that company takes care of the emailing, the contact, the scheduling, the test, the results, the communication of the results. They take care of it all. While these tests can help us identify trace amounts of a prohibited substance, they don't help us determine the amount, the frequency of use, the time since last use, or the degree of impairment. Administration is extremely costly. In Central Illinois, for example, a urine drug test can cost anywhere between $50 to $100, just depending on how many people are being tested. Finally, in some jobs, drug tests are not perceived as fair, but that's only in some jobs. So you really have to think about how much money do you want to spend in the selection process? Is this job relevant? Medical exams are used to assess physical and mental health. These are different from physical ability tests. Medical exams have to do with your health. We might check your cholesterol, your heart. We might conduct a psychological evaluation with a psychiatrist. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, job offers have to be made before medical exams. One of the reasons for this is because we don't want employers learning about disabilities earlier in the process before they offer jobs. In some situations, when an employer learns about a disability, they then must attempt to accommodate that applicant's disability in some way. You can't just say, oh, well, you have a disability, I don't like it, I don't want to hire you. It doesn't work that way. That is all for the week 4 lecture. Thank you for hanging in there. I know this lecture was one of the longer ones in the class. Next week, we will focus on job performance, how to measure it, appraise it, and the following week, we will learn how to improve it through training programs and development opportunities.